Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Brennan Center for Justice event. I'm Lisa Benenson, Vice President for Communications and Strategy at Brennan Center. Unfortunately, Yamiche Alcindor is unable to join us this evening. With us tonight to lead this timely conversation about the fight to vote, I'm so pleased to welcome NYU professor, frequent MSNBC commentator, and Brennan Center board member Melissa Murray. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. First, we'll leave you time for questions at the end of this discussion. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please feel free to add them via YouTube and Facebook chat. Second, civility is important to all of us at Brennan Center. Those who post rude or intemperate language in our message streams here on YouTube and Facebook will be removed from the conversation. Lastly, we provide live closed captioning. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works to repair, revitalize, and when necessary, defend our systems of democracy and justice. We're grateful to our producing partner for this event, NYU's John Bradamus Center, which advocates for civil debate in politics and public policy. And with that, Melissa, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Lisa, and welcome to everyone in our audience. My name is Melissa Murray, and I am the Frederick I. and Grace Stokes Professor of Law at NYU Law, and I'm also a member of the Brennan Center's board. Regrettably, however, I am not Yamiche Alcindor, and like so many of you, I am a big fan of Yamiche Alcindor. Nevertheless, although Yamiche cannot join us tonight, I'm delighted to step into her shoes for this conversation, which, as Lisa says, could not be more timely. The right to vote is at the heart of the American experiment, yet today we see extraordinary controversy over that right and the shape of our democracy. The right to vote has become the fight to vote. But is this new? Or has this always been a part of the American story from the beginning? As we speak tonight, Democratic senators are about to try to change the Senate rules to allow for a talking filibuster on critical voting legislation that is intended to protect our democracy, forcing Republican senators to the floor to promote a public debate. What does all of this mean, and what's likely to happen? Who better to answer that question than Michael Waldman, the president of the Brennan Center for Justice? Michael is the author of the book, The Fight to Vote, which the Washington Post named a notable nonfiction book in 2016, the year it was first published. And no less than the late Representative John Lewis said that this book delivers a message every American needs to hear. And this week, The Fight to Vote has been re-released in a new edition with 2 new chapters on the 2020 election and everything that has happened since. This is truly a first draft of history in progress. To order the book, you can use the link that is in the chat. But while you're taking a look at that, please join me in welcoming this book's author, Michael Waldman. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's my delight to be here. So you are exactly the person I want to talk to about this. Can you please help us make sense of what is happening on the Hill right now and where we stand with respect to this voting rights legislation?
Well, you're right that it's happening in live time at this very moment. And if there are exciting or unexpected developments, we will update everybody. This is a very big moment in the long history of American democracy. We fought over this right to vote from the beginning, but we face challenges we have not faced in a long time, if ever. And as you know, in 2020, despite the pandemic and despite voter suppression, it was the highest voter turnout since 1900. It's an extraordinary achievement. What was the response? We should praise and thank for that. Instead, the response was Donald Trump's big lie that the election had been stolen, the insurrection driven by that big lie, and then over the past year, a wave of new voting laws in states to restrict the vote, and not just that, to change who counts the votes. It is something we have not seen in this country in a long time. And as we at the Brennan Center have argued, and as I write about in the book, Congress has the power to stop this. It has the power legally and constitutionally. The question has always been, does it have the political will? Well, today we're finding out at least one answer. Right now, the Senate.
Oh, sorry, Michael. I didn't mean to cut you off. I was going to say, for those of us who don't spend a ton of time reading the Constitution, it's through the elections clause that's what empowers Congress to act to deal with these restrictive voting laws at the state level. Is that right?
That's right. It is one of the great things that you get to do when you go back and look at American history is to take a look at the drafting of the Constitution. They took this part of the Constitution really seriously. The elections clause says that the state legislature set the time, place, and manner of elections, but that Congress has the power to override that and to set national standards. And they did that precisely because James Madison was convinced that state legislatures were corrupt, that they would be captured by what they called factions, but we would call political parties, and that they would engage in what we would now call voter suppression or gerrymandering. Now, they didn't call it that, of course. Elbridge Gerry was standing there, among other things, and they hadn't coined the word, but that is actually why that's in there and what they were talking about. And it was pretty wise. Madison had a real sense of the avarice and political greed in human nature, and we're seeing that play out right now. And the Congress has emphatically the power to do this under that part of the Constitution.
So is this why you decided to intervene to add these two new chapters? I mean, we seem to be on a precipice. We saw events that are unprecedented in the history of this country in 2020, from the events at the Capitol on January 6th to the second impeachment of the same president. And now we are engaged in what seems to be a struggle, a tension between expanding the right to vote to include those who historically have been marginalized, and an effort to retrench and close off the right to vote in order to solidify and cement power in certain areas.
Yes, this, if we were writing a book like this 20 years from now, this period of time certainly would be a central part of the American story, because it's such a big deal. Both the drama of trying to stage an election in the middle of a pandemic, and then the response by Trump, by his followers, the belief in the big lie, and the effort to make it harder, as you say, for marginalized communities, for the changing country to be represented through our democracy. So much of the story of the fight to vote over the years is that exact thing, that as new groups or groups that are locked out demand their place at the table of our democracy, other people fight back and try to stop it from happening. There are some times that are sort of quiet, and there are other times when great forces clash, and we could be moving forward to really make our government representative of the country as it is now and going forward, or we could lurch backwards. That has happened also in the country's history.
So, Michael, maybe just to get some sense of longitudinalness in all of this, we're so focused on this moment right now and everything that has happened since the election of 2020. But as you say in the book, this isn't new. We've seen these things before. There have just been different players and different issues, but the same impulses come back over and over and over again. So can you maybe identify some of the progenitors of this moment that we're in now? Where have we seen this same kind of impulse in our history? And how have we managed to come out of it to expand the franchise and to secure our democracy when it has been incredibly fragile?
You're exactly right. We've had these arguments from the beginning. When the country started, we were anything but what any of us would regard as a democracy. Only white men who owned property could vote. That was a legacy of British colonialism. But even then, there were forces that began to stir, that began to challenge those traditional ideas. The Declaration of Independence and the preamble, which said we are all created equal, and that government is legitimate, it said, only when it rests on the consent of the governed. Yes, they were hypocrites at best when they wrote that. Thomas Jefferson, as he wrote that, was being attended to by a 14-year-old enslaved boy. But the ideas were so powerful and so radical, frankly, they began to shake things up. In 1776, the states had to each write their own constitutions because they were now independent of Britain. In Pennsylvania, Ben Franklin wrote the state's constitution, and that state abolished that property requirement for voting. And Ben Franklin said, there's a man who owns a jackass worth $50. so the man can vote. Then the jackass dies. The man is older, he's wiser, but the jackass is dead, so the man cannot vote. So Ben Franklin asked, who really has the right to vote, the man or the jackass? Good question. One more reason we love Ben Franklin. Up in Massachusetts, John Adams was writing their constitution. And people urged him, they said, hey, do what they did down in Pennsylvania, get rid of the property requirement. John Adams was aghast at that idea. He said, if we do that, women will demand the right to vote. Lads of 18 will think their interest insufficiently attended to, they will demand a right to vote. And men who hath not a farthing to their name will think themselves worthy of an equal voice in government, and they will demand the right to vote. John Adams said, there will be no end of it. And, you know, that's kind of the American story. The push for expanded rights and a full democracy, the response, the pushback, the backlash, and the expansion over many years. There is no end of it. It's, of course, been around race. It's been around gender. It's been around class. It's some of the great issues in our country's history. Unfortunately, as I said, it doesn't only move in one direction. Certainly the period after the Civil War offers some very bracing cautions for us today, I would say.
In what way?
Well, after the Civil War, 1 out of 5 Union soldiers was a black man. And when Abraham Lincoln gave his second inaugural address, it was to a crowd that was very heavily racially mixed. And Lincoln had not been for voting rights for black men, but he actually gave a speech at the White House and came out for voting rights from the second floor window of the White House. One of the people in the audience was John Wilkes Booth. And when Lincoln said that, he said to the person next to him, he said, that means citizenship. That is the last speech he will ever give. And he tried to get the guy next to him to shoot Lincoln on the spot. And when he couldn't persuade him to do that, he said, well, then by God, I will put him through. And that was the spark for Booth to go to Ford's Theater 2 days later. This issue of voting rights was at the center of things after the Civil War. And in the 15th Amendment, passed on a party line vote by the Republicans, black men in the South were guaranteed the right to vote. And there was a tremendous flowering of democracy, massive voter participation. Well, we know that there was terrorism, there was political cowardice, and that right was taken away when Reconstruction ended. And the story that's relevant for us now is not just that things went backwards, which they did, but it didn't happen right away. In 1890, not in 1876 when Reconstruction ended, but in 1890, half the voters in Mississippi were black. But there was an assault on their right to vote, and Congress looked at stepping up. A voting rights bill passed the House and went to the Senate, and just like today, it faced a filibuster, and the filibuster defeated that bill. And when that happened, that gave a green light to the southern states, and they then enacted the Jim Crow laws. And the result was 7 decades of disenfranchisement and discrimination. What happens in Washington can have a real consequence for people, real people out in the rest of the country. And the lesson of our history is that it doesn't only move in a positive direction. There can be a real turn in the wrong direction. And we may be facing something like that now. Things could get worse.
That seemed to be the mood when President Biden made that speech at the Atlanta University Center the other day, in which he exhorted the Senate to pass the voting rights legislation and also to limit the use of the filibuster when voting rights legislation was pending. And he used some very evocative language. He asked, are you on the side of Dr. King, or are you on the side of Bull Connor, the famous Alabama sheriff who had been so vociferously against the civil rights movement? And many of the president's critics in Washington, including Senate Majority Leader McConnell, said that that kind of language was really intemperate. But it seems, based on the history that you're highlighting here, it's actually quite accurate. Not intemperate at all, but really sort of charting a thread that leads from that moment to this one.
Yes, I mean, look, Biden's opponents, got the vapors on cue, and a lot of the media followed that easily predictable response and took it seriously. It's certainly the case that the laws that we're looking at right now are not as bad as the laws that were in effect in 1965. Black voter participation is much higher in the South, and in fact, we're still living in the country that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 created, which was for the first time a true multiracial democracy in our country. But the basic forces are not that different. The laws that are in effect in these states now, and many of which are proposed going forward, some are worse than others, some are better than others, but unfortunately, they are rather invariably targeted to curb the participation of Black voters, of Latino voters, of Asian voters, Native voters, young voters, and even the Jim Crow laws were written in a way, and the book describes much of the mischievous genius, I suppose, behind some of these laws. They were written in a way to not specifically and explicitly exclude voters based on race, but they were just applied in a way that had an almost entirely successful effort to disenfranchise people. So I think that the rhetoric was hot, but I think that the broad question is the same. Senators tonight are going to have to choose. Are they for voting rights, or are they for letting the Senate obstruct something that is utterly urgent for the country, I would say. And this isn't the first time that's happened. The Senate has been, through its procedures, a graveyard for many voting rights bills over the years. Unfortunately, we're possibly seeing that again today.
And it's worth noting that famously Strom Thurmond, the senator from South Carolina, who was an ardent segregationist for much of his career, famously filibustered the Voting Rights Act before it was ultimately passed on the Senate floor. So we've seen this before, and the filibuster perhaps amplifies and allows this instinct toward minority rule to continue to be perpetuated. Can we come back to something that you said about the drive to sort of limit how the franchise is expanded? What is the fear of having a multiracial democracy? I mean, because that seems to be the driving force. I mean, at least initially, there's this fear about enfranchising those who are not property owners. And so, perhaps that is about the possibility of mob rule. But as we go along in our history, it really does become racialized. This fight over the vote becomes one about expanding into the body politic those individuals who may not look like those who previously were the body politic. So how have we seen that? What does it mean? And what is the fear about a multiracial democracy?
Well, I think it goes to so many core issues of people's identity and people's fear of change. The country, of course, has been majority white from the start, but the demography of the country is changing. This census that was done last year, that we now are analyzing the results of, shows that the country is changing. It's changing in a multiplicity of ways. It's actually changing into a kaleidoscope of diversity of people from all over the world. It's actually, I think, a very exciting prospect for what the country can be, but that can be threatening to a lot of people. And, we can untangle why people are threatened, whether their economic situation makes them more prone to racist appeals. But a lot of this, unfortunately, increasingly becomes nakedly racial. When people talk about voter fraud, very often, and you hear it in the way Donald Trump talks about it, what they mean is people who don't look like me voting must be potentially shady, must be fraud. When Trump tried to get the votes thrown out from Detroit and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, I don't think anybody was fooled into not noticing that those are cities with very substantial Black populations, in Atlanta. When Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, signed into law the voting bill that was so controversial last year, that was the first one in this batch of new voting laws, he sat there flanked on either side by 6 white men in suits. I'm a white man in a suit, but that is who was there. And it turned out they were standing in front of they were sitting in front of a painting of a slave plantation from Georgia. These, it's like what Faulkner said: the past is never past on some of these issues. The issue of immigration is also a very central one. A lot of these new laws target immigrants and the Latino community as well. And one of the things that's interesting that I learned in researching the fight to vote is we know the story of both the winning of voting rights by Black men in the late 1800s and then its brutally being taken away. At that same time in the late 1800s, there was tremendous immigration to the northern cities. These were Catholics, these were Jews, these were people from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. And in the North, it wasn't as bad as the Jim Crow laws, but a whole host of restrictions were put in place to make it so that immigrants couldn't vote. When there's demographic change, when there's economic dislocation, when there's inequality, very often part of the response is that the people who have power try to stop others from getting some of that power as well.
Right. I just want to remind our audience that this conversation should not just be between me and Michael. We would love to have you be a part of it as well. So please put your questions in the chat and we will bring those up toward the end of the conversation and filter them in some of the questions here. So please feel free to do that. You mentioned Donald Trump, Michael, and I think any discussion of what has happened with regard to voting rights and the restrictive voting laws that have been passed since the 2020 election cannot be explained without resort to Donald Trump's campaign to discredit the election of 2020. And just this past weekend, once again, he told others about the quote unquote big lie, this claim that the 2020 election was stolen. What was so unusual in the end about what Donald Trump did? As you suggest, there have always been challenged elections before. What made the challenge to the 2020 election so distinctive and indeed so terrifying?
I really do think that some of this is very new and very scary, as you say. We've had people trying to make it harder for other Americans to vote. We've had a lot of raw and rambunctious politics around these issues of democracy. What we have never had in this country, at least maybe since the Civil War, is a political leader, a president of the United States, the leader of one of the two political parties, saying that our democracy is a fraud. The big lie is it cannot be said often enough, a lie. The election of 2020, like all our current elections, was extraordinarily secure. But Trump said over and over again that it was rigged, that it was stolen. He had these absurd people working for him claiming that it was, voting machines and Italian spy satellites and all this utterly crazy nonsense. And the unfortunate fact is now tens of millions of people believe him. He may be cynical. The other politicians around him may be cynical, but these ordinary Americans are hearing this from their leaders and they take it very seriously. And so now, right after the election, 70% of Republican voters believe the election was stolen. And a year later or more, the same number holds. That is a tremendously unnerving discrediting of our democracy. And we see in that rally in Arizona, which is hard to watch, not just Trump continuing to spew these falsehoods about the election being stolen, but political leader after political leader following him saying the same thing. And you now have something, again, that we have not had, which is one of the two political parties, the Republican Party, for the moment anyway, is dominated by this attack on American democracy, this attack on the institutions of representative government. We haven't had that. You could argue, I suppose, that Jefferson Davis, when he attacked our democracy, but since then it has been an article of faith that we have a peaceful transfer of power and that we don't, in our country, undermine the basic institutions. What I'm hopeful is that there's a counter movement. It's the movement that's been pushing for this legislation. It's a democracy movement, very broad, very diverse, involving political figures, and right now Democrats, that also, for the first time, is focusing on these issues. And so I do think going forward, the health of our democracy, the shape of our democracy, is not just going to be something for the law books. It's not going to be a technical matter, but it's going to be something people really fight about in our political process.
So this legislation that's currently pending was already slated and had been passed by the House back in 2019. It's been repassed and reenacted. It still needs to get through the Senate. And it was set up to address a range of concerns that existed even before the 2020 election. But we've seen since the 2020 election, not only the insurrection on the Capitol on January 6th, which seemed to be fueled by the big lie and this idea that the election had been stolen, but also this proliferation of restrictive voting laws at the state level that aim to correct what is used in the book is vanishingly rare cases of voter fraud. How does all of this impact the voters? What does it look like at the state level? Like, what is this legislation meant to address? And by the time we get to it, if we get to it, will it actually be the vehicle that we need to address what has happened since the 2020 election? And I think we have a slide that shows how much legislation has been passed in the last couple of months since the election.
Yes, as the slide shows, and thank you, Melissa, for sharing it, 19 states have passed 34 restrictive voting laws, and they're not done yet. The legislatures are coming back. It's January. There's 152 laws carried forward from 2021 to 2022. Again, some of them are worse than others. One of the things that is particularly scary to me is on top of the existing curbs on vote by mail, curbs on early voting, are new twists, attacks on election officials, laws like in Texas, for example, basically imposing criminal penalties on election officials who try to help people to vote, who send out application forms, legal application forms for absentee ballots, for example. And then even newer and more scary in some respects are truly dystopian laws that change who counts the votes, that takes the power away from neutral or nonpartisan election officials and puts it in the hands of legislators, partisan legislators. In Georgia, you remember Brad Raffensperger is the Secretary of State of Georgia. He's no friend of the Brennan Center of Voting Rights most of the time. But when push came to shove, he did stand up to Donald Trump, who was demanding that he fix the election. And we remember that phone call where Trump said, look, all I need you to do is find 11,000 votes. And Raffensperger said no, and they released the tape of the phone call. Well, the response of the Georgia legislature was late in the process of passing their bill, they took the Secretary of State out of the counting of the determining of the winner of the election and effectively gave it to the state legislature. That is truly got the whiff of authoritarianism, quite honestly. The other day, President Trump did a video for a local party committee where he said, basically, look, I don't really care about the rules of who votes. What matters is who counts the votes. And one hesitates to draw this analogy, but there is a quote that is almost word for word the same thing from Joseph Stalin. This is something that we see in a backlash to democracy all over the world. There's a lot of backsliding and retrenchment, whether it's in Turkey, whether it's in Central Europe in places like Hungary and Poland, whether in the Philippines, in India with some of the things that are going on there. All over the world, there was a real pushback to what had seemed like a real triumph of liberal democracy. And unfortunately, we hear echoes of that in what Trump is doing and this particular twist of these new laws, which would be addressed in significant measure by the federal legislation should it pass.
So if this legislation is passed, I mean, is it truly equipped to deal with all of the threats to our democratic structure that are currently in play, or will more be necessary?
It's a really strong bill. It does a few things. First of all, it sets national standards on vote by mail to make sure everybody has access to it, on early voting. It makes automatic voter registration the law of the land. It addresses the gerrymandering that is going on all over the country in the wake of the census, where people are redrawing the lines, and it actually bans partisan gerrymandering. It also deals with racial discrimination in voting, because it is now combined the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act with the other piece of legislation. As you know, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was in many ways the most successful civil rights law. It said that states with a history of discrimination in voting could not change their voting rules without permission in advance from the Justice Department or a federal court. That was called preclearance. It worked extraordinarily well and really, again, created the country we're all happy to live in today. And as you know, in 2013, the US Supreme Court gutted that law. And that was when Chief Justice Roberts said, well, that was then, this is now, this is basically a thing of the past. And where Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in her famous dissent, said, that's like standing in a rainstorm, holding an umbrella and not getting wet and saying, oh, I'm not wet, and throwing away your umbrella. That was the dissent that made her the notorious RBG, I think. Really, people heard it, and her prediction was right. Very quickly, states were passing laws, the first wave of laws, to make it harder for people to vote in states that once had been covered by the Voting Rights Act. And unfortunately, in the last year, the Supreme Court saw that there was another part of the Voting Rights Act that was still left standing, and it took a wrecking ball to that part as well. And that's restored. The Voting Rights Act is restored in this legislation. So there are some things that can't be fixed by federal legislation, but there are protections for election officials. And I think that national standards on some of the raw material of the big lie would make a big difference.
So you've mentioned the court a couple of times, and it's actually the first time the court has come up in our conversation. We've talked about state legislatures, we've talked about Congress and the executive. We haven't talked about the court. And you've sort of laid out in some detail that the court has acted, or at least the modern Roberts Court, has been instrumental in dismantling some of the scaffolding that protects voting rights in this country. But I think many of the readers of this book will be surprised to see that the court is not really a major actor in the fight to expand and preserve a multiracial democracy throughout the history of this country. In fact, there's only one sort of shining glimmer of a moment for the court, and that's really where the Warren Court upholds the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s. Do you worry that a court that is necessarily set up by constitutional design to be a minoritarian institution will not be receptive to and protective of voting rights, whether it is passed by Congress or whether individual states take measures to preserve the franchise within their own boundaries?
Well, you're exactly right. And it is a little bit of a surprising story for people who look to or assume the Supreme Court is going to be the heroic force riding in with their robes flapping to save democracy. Throughout the country's history, the real progress has come in the streets, it's come in legislatures or at the ballot box, but the courts have largely either been bad or kind of mostly washed their hands. We at the Brennan Center, of course, are very proud of the one person, one vote rulings that Justice Brennan was so instrumental in the 1960s, but those were unusual. What's particularly troubling right now is Chief Justice John Roberts really has focused a lot on actually knocking down the scaffolding of democratic protections. We saw it in Citizens United in 2010, where a century of campaign finance law was overturned. We saw it, as I said, in 2013 in Shelby County on the Voting Rights Act, and again last year. And the court refused to get involved in policing partisan gerrymandering in the Rucho case of 2019. And in case after case, this Supreme Court has never struck down one of these restrictive state voting laws. So you're right that the court, by its design, is a minoritarian institution. It is a counterweight in some respects to the democratically accountable branches. But there's a real risk that the court will be way out of sync with the country as it's developing, as it's changing. We have an interesting situation right now where the one political party, the Democrats, have won the popular vote in 7 of the last 8 presidential elections. Yet the other political party, the Republicans, of course, have chosen 6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices. It's now a supermajority of very conservative justices. And there's a real risk that the court is going to veer off from the public consensus, and that, along with a lot of other institutions of American democracy, will become more and more of an anti-democratic force. And I will say that it's the subject of my next book.
Well, maybe we can get a little preview. I find this part so interesting because you're exactly right. There are so many places where the court seems to be behind majoritarian preferences. And of course, the court's legitimacy really depends on the public believing that what the court is doing is principled and legitimate in some way. And yeah, I think the court tries very hard to kind of stay within the step of public so that it doesn't go too far or lag too far behind. But one place where the court seems to be really out of step with most Americans is in the area of abortion rights, not necessarily voting rights. And I think we've talked a lot in lots of different contexts about the assault on reproductive rights, sometimes in Brennan Center events like this one. But I don't think we ever talk about the way in which there actually is a through line connecting the assaults to reproductive rights and campaign finance and this assault on voting rights, but all of it seems to be inextricably linked. And you talk about this in your book. At one point, you note that Mitch McConnell, in his zeal to dismantle campaign finance laws, actually appoints to the project of dismantling the campaign finance regulations, the person who is the general counsel of the largest pro-life group in the United States. So it is interesting that these different interests actually line up in a lot of ways, and there is a thread linking all of them. And you talk a lot about this in the book, that these are all inextricably linked.
And these issues of democracy and law are far from technical and arcane. They are utterly intertwined with these basic issues of power and personal freedom. The states that have been most aggressive in taking away women's reproductive freedom are the states that are the most gerrymandered. They are the states where there are the most restrictions on voting. And it isn't all throughout the country, the dark money in the political system that the Supreme Court's rulings, as I describe in the book, have allowed in. In other words, big secret money in our elections. That also is a force that's pushing to the right, pushing political figures to be very aggressive in taking on women's health and taking away women's rights. It is all joined together. And one of the things that's interesting and I guess encouraging about the current moment is that you've seen, even in the last week or two, reproductive rights groups, women's groups, LGBTQ groups saying, we know that there may be moments where the filibuster might benefit us or the issues we care about because it's going to protect something we care about. But nevertheless, we have to have this voting rights legislation. We have to have this bill. And even in the last few days, Emily's List and NARAL have said that they will not support senators, and Senator Sinema is somebody who is on everyone's minds, who aren't willing to stand up for voting rights when it counts. Same with the LGBTQ groups. And so it's a very significant moment where people are starting to see the inextricable linkage among all these things, and that a fight for democracy is not an abstract thing. It's not just, something for the 4th of July, but it will affect the lives of people all across the country.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We have a number of fantastic comments from the chat that I want to bring in here. You mentioned earlier in our conversation, Michael, that you think things could get worse, and one of our audience members would like you to elaborate. What could happen? How could it be worse than the way it is right now?
We could do a drinking game, and well, so first of all, as I say, the laws that have been passed in states across the country in the past year, they're not as bad as what Bull Connor enforced. A black woman is vice president of the United States, elected in this past election by an electorate that was principally women and people of color, in a very high turnout election. But as I say, the restrictions that are being pushed are targeted. They don't affect everybody equally. When the law in Georgia says, we're going to eliminate mobile voting. Well, the only place where mobile voting existed in Georgia is Fulton County, in other words, Atlanta. And again, if there's open terrain for state governments to abuse the rights of their own people, politicians will seize that opportunity. And especially politicians catering to backlash, catering to what may be a threatened white nationalist sentiment. And so you could get much worse voting laws because, unfortunately, if Congress is off the beat, the federal cop is off the beat, and the courts wash their hands and say, we prefer not to get involved, there's very little that can stop some of the worst abuses. So my dystopian worry is what we don't know yet. And the assumption that things aren't, when we see a snapshot now, and one of the arguments that is made both by opponents of this legislation and by sort of the smarty pants pundits who are trying to come up with something interesting to say, they say, oh, this isn't that bad. Look at this law. It's not so bad here. It's not so bad there. And, my answer is, yeah, give it time. So that's one of the worries that I have. I also think as well that you have a risk of almost a self-perpetuating perpetual motion machine where the Supreme Court has issued rulings as it has, really dismantling so many of the protections for equality in our political system on campaign finance, on voting, refusal to get involved in redistricting, often in a way that really is very partisan in the impact. And that then enables states to pass more of these laws or to deal with things like abortion rights. And then the politicians who are elected as a result of that put more people on the court. And it becomes the very thing that the framers feared and that earlier Supreme Courts worried about, which is that it becomes impossible to dislodge what is effectively a minority control over our government and system as the country is changing. Our country is getting more diverse, it's getting younger. And not only the Supreme Court, but the Senate, which is built in a way that is designed to not be a pure one person, one vote, of course, institution. James Madison really regretted that. So did Hamilton. But of course, it's the states, but the difference in size between the smallest state and the biggest state, it has grown and grown. And it's a rural bias that is also going to be reflected in the courts and the judges who get confirmed. So there's a real risk of kind of a retrenchment and entrenchment all across the system.
So another audience member wants you to push on this, and with regard to partisan gerrymandering, as you note in the book, in 2018, the Supreme Court basically absented itself from the whole question of how to rule on partisan gerrymander, said that there could be no verifiable justiciable standard for determining when a gerrymander had gone too far in one direction, and basically left it to the states. But we have seen, at least in the last couple of weeks, some states have really stepped up to the plate. So in Ohio Supreme Court, for example, just struck down the state's redistricting plan on the ground that it went too far to favor one particular political party. Do we need to worry about partisan gerrymandering, since it seems like some of the states seem to have taken this in hand?
Well, the story on gerrymandering and on redistricting is not all bad. In a lot of the country, over the past decade, things have gotten better. That's true in a place like Ohio or Michigan or Nevada or other places like that, where there are ballot initiatives. And as you know, the Brennan Center has been very involved in actually helping to write and work for enactment of a number of these ballot measures. And the court case in Ohio, which we were one of the parties that brought the case, interestingly, was under the state constitution and under state law. So in a lot of the country, things have gotten better. You also have states, compared to 10 years ago, you have states where, like in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Michigan, where the Democrats control the governorship, the Republicans control the legislature, gerrymandered legislature, but it sort of split government, so they have to negotiate. And you can't see one party or another dominating. But in a lot of the country, and this is true especially in the South and Southwest, which is one party control, that's where gerrymandering is going to be worse than before. You're going to have new gerrymanders piled on top of the old gerrymanders. Most of the population growth, nearly all the population growth in the US under the census, came in the South and the Southwest. And 95% of it was communities of color, especially Latinos, but all communities of color. Those are the folks, put aside partisan impact, those are the folks whose voices risk being choked off in these gerrymanders. And so, the Supreme Court said, oh, this is too hard for us to figure out. The standards are too hard on partisan gerrymandering. And look, there's a reason, arguably, why the Supreme Court hasn't done this before. It is hard to know what's too much partisanship in redistricting, but there are ways to do it. But what the Supreme Court did say also is that Congress has the ability to deal with it. They actually, in the 2019 Rucho versus Common Cause decision, pointed to the legislation that's now in front of Congress and said, well, that's a constitutional example of Congress's ability to regulate redistricting. I don't think Chief Justice Roberts thought for a second that it would ever actually come close to passage when he pre-approved it in that way. But Congress does have this power. And so between state constitutions, between the federal action, and the other thing is that, at least in theory, racial gerrymandering is still illegal. Now, the Voting Rights Act has been gravely weakened, but it is still illegal. Unfortunately, what that has led to is people defending some of these egregiously drawn maps say, oh, yeah, it's true that our map keeps Black voters, keeps Latino voters from electing people, but don't worry, it's just partisanship. And that's the good old American way. And the Supreme Court said that was just fine. So basically, they're trying to redefine everything as partisan exuberance, even if it's got a very, very clear racial dimension.
Yeah, that's definitely a thread that we have seen in the court's jurisprudence around this area. Given the shifting tilt of the demographic profile of some of these states and the sort of demographic character of the country, what do you think is the biggest threat to democracy? Is it voter suppression of those groups or manipulation of the electoral count?
I think they go hand in hand. I think that the manipulation of the electoral count is a new development, a new anti-democratic trend.
Mhm.
But that is made easier when people think that if someone who doesn't look like them vote, it must be voter fraud. That's one of the reasons that I think these substantive guarantees about early voting, about vote by mail, are an important step in stopping that kind of election subversion. Because basically, if it's a uniform standard, then you can't have the allegations made with at least as much vim and vigor as they are made. Oh, there was something fishy about how these rules were changed to make it so people can vote. If that's just the federal law and everybody has to follow it. As you look forward at the future of the country, it's a great challenge to have demographic change as profound as we have now and as we expect to have going forward. And it's not easy to predict entirely how it plays out. It's not easy to predict, of course, in partisan terms. We saw in this last election moves toward the Republicans among Latinos and Asians, for example, in ways that had not been seen before or had been expected. But it is a challenge for any country to undergo demographic change and to make it work and to make it something that is a source of strength and to have it not be a source merely of disruption and backlash. And the key to that is to have a working democratic system so that the government over time responds to and looks like the country. John Adams, I gave him a dig early on when he didn't want to take away the property requirement. But John Adams said rather famously that the legislature ought to look like the population, like a mirror. Well, that's a pretty good way of thinking about it. And if the country changes and the political system doesn't because our democracy is broken, things will get quite disruptive and quite ugly going forward.
Well, with that in mind, more doomsday questions from the audience. I think I think everyone is legitimately
I
quite
got chill pill,
by what they're seeing. How do we ensure that the 2022 midterm elections will be conducted fairly and in a manner that allows all who want to participate and who are eligible to participate to do so?
Well, one of the key things is, first of all, to pass this legislation, of course, but another is to defend and speak out and work on behalf of election officials. You wouldn't think that would be that important, but it turns out that nonpartisan election officials are really an unsung but very critical part of all of this. Elections in this country are not run by the national government. They're not really run by states. They're run by counties and in local areas. And these election officials are under assault. They're under assault from the same forces pushing the big lie. The Brennan Center works with a lot of them. We've actually done a survey. Bennenson's strategy group did a survey of election officials. 1 out of 3 election officials has been threatened, and many of them have faced threats of violence. And this is really, really outrageous. And, these are not the most glamorous jobs. They're not in this for the money, these folks. They've been just doing their public service and participating, and now they're under attack. And, just standing up for those election officials, running for election official office, making sure that people vote for election officials of both parties who want a fair election and not to guarantee and make it easier to steal the next one. One way to look at it, which is back to the dystopian doom scrolling version of all this, is more and more we now know that Donald Trump really did try to overthrow American democracy and really did try to undo the election. His efforts were chaotic and clown-like and obviously unsuccessful. But there's no guarantee that that will be the case next time. And what we have seen over the past year, and in an accelerating way, is a systematic drive to remove the obstacles to him doing it again or to somebody else doing it. Someone doing it in a smarter way. The removal of election officials, the attacks on election officials, the changing of the counting of the votes, and the restrictions on who votes. All of that has to be understood in this context, that this is a really big fight we're facing for the very essence of American democracy. I hesitate to be dramatic in that way, but I think we all feel in our bones that we're living through something very significant. And part of the answer is for the pro-democracy forces of both parties and no party to be just as energized as those who would undo our democracy.
So what can those of us who are in these sort of safe blue spaces like New York or California, for example, do to address what's happening throughout the country in some of these red and purple states? How can we confront and challenge these efforts to suppress the vote, and indeed to challenge the security and the integrity of elections going forward? Like, what exactly can we do as individuals beyond becoming the supervisor of elections at our respective counties?
Well, and New York State certainly got its own problems with our elections, though. A lot of the issues here are due to incompetence, I believe, rather than explicitly racially malevolent conduct.
Incompetence rather than malfeasance.
Yes, which I guess that's progress, right? But we all ought to make sure that our own system is better. I think that, and this is partly because politics is nationalized in some significant ways, we can all speak out and make sure that this moment where we're focusing right now on the issues of democracy, on the health of our democracy, on voting rights, the way we are tonight on the floor of the Senate, we should make sure that that continues. Doesn't mean it has to be the bill they're talking about for the next year, but it means that we all need to make sure that this issue of democracy is at the center of our debate and politics, because the attack on democracy certainly is. We can speak out and actually in encouraging the political leaders who are already in this fight to keep at it. You mentioned California and New York. Speaker Pelosi has been tremendous on this. She's been a real driving force. She said at one point that she was staying in Congress to work on this legislation. And Majority Leader Chuck Schumer in New York has really, really stepped into the lead. He has been deeply engaged working with us and with voting rights groups, with civil rights groups, day by day, meeting by meeting, in a rather extraordinary way. I think that his heart is really in this. And I think people don't necessarily know that. And I think we all ought to be saying thank you when our leaders do stand up. And, one of the unexpected lessons of history, I think, that I learned, at least in researching the book, is that we all have a notion that, well, this stuff is the province of outside prophetic voices or nonpartisan voices, and of course, often that is true, but it's actually been the raw material for partisan politics over the years. It turns out that most of the expansions of voting rights that have happened have been done by one party over the objection of another over the course of history. So what we see today, where the Democrats are pushing these voting rights bills and the Republicans are opposing them, that's actually not, it may not be pretty, but it isn't unusual. And we're also seeing something, I think, quite extraordinary. When you look at the history of the country on these things, you have outside organizers, activists, moral voices like Frederick Douglass pushing, and somebody like Abraham Lincoln on the inside, or in the fight for women's voting rights, Alice Paul.
An NYU law grad.
Well, and Inez Milholland,
NYU law grad,
who's a special hero in the book, pushing, but Woodrow Wilson temporizing and then eventually coming out, or of course Dr. King and LBJ. Now, for the first time, you're starting to see political figures like Stacey Abrams, who are both outside voting rights activists and inside political powerhouses. And I think she's actually a pretty significant figure in combining those. You've seen this in other issues. It's really the first time in recent years. And I do think, again, given the connection we both have to NYU School of Law, Inez Milholland and the story of how women won the right to vote is such a great story. And it was young women, and Inez Milholland, if I could tell the story a little bit of the role she played, she was a recent graduate of NYU Law. She was a radical young lawyer. And the day before the presidential inauguration in 1913, Woodrow Wilson arrived at the train station in Washington, expecting a big crowd. And there was nobody there. There was the Princeton Glee Club. That was it. And finally, they kind of looked around, and one of his aides said, "Where are all the people?" Well, it turned out they were on Pennsylvania Avenue, where there was the first great march for voting rights down Pennsylvania Avenue for women's voting rights. And it was 5,000 women. And they were surrounded on either side by 100,000 men, who many of them drunk. They were there for the inaugural. And the men started throwing things and spitting, and they broke through the police lines and beat up the women. And they had to fight their way to the end of Pennsylvania Avenue. And leading that march on a horse, dressed as a Greek goddess, was this recent NYU law graduate, Inez Milholland. And this was a very big deal. This dominated the coverage. It sort of dwarfed the coverage of Wilson's inaugural. The police chief of Washington, D.C. had to resign, and public opinion swung overnight from opposition to women's suffrage to support because of the widely publicized images of peaceful voting rights marchers being attacked. Well, that, of course, sounds like Selma. And this was the Selma for the women's rights movement. And it was, as we know, it was far from a pure and pristine march. As I describe in the book, the great journalist Ida B. Wells, who documented lynching, was part of the organizing and then was told not to march with the white women, and she jumped in the line anyway. It showed the racial divisions that marked that fight and continued to mark the country in voting up until 1965. But it was an extraordinary thing. You know, the textbooks sometimes say women were given the right to vote. Well, they weren't given anything. It required just as much creative protest energy, insider and outsider fights, pioneering tactics and strategies before Gandhi, before the American labor movement used sit-down strikes, The women's movement in the United States, the suffrage movement, pioneered them and won this extraordinary victory and doubled the size of the electorate overnight. And it's a story many, many people don't know.
Yeah, it's a terrific story. And I misspoke. Alice Paul is actually a graduate of American University's Law School and Swarthmore College, but she worked in very close collaboration with Inez Milholland and Crystal Eastman, both of whom were NYU law graduates. NYU is one of the first law schools to admit women, and we continue to be on the forefront of women's legal education. But for one last question, Michael, before we wrap things up, the book has some incredibly moving stories about ordinary people who were moved to step up and to get into this fight. People like Katie Fahey, who wanted to stop partisan gerrymandering in Michigan, and Desmond Meade, who worked valiantly in Florida to enfranchise formerly convicted persons. What can all of us as individuals do to protect what Justice Kagan has called the foundation of all of our other rights? How can we as individuals in this moment make a change to help preserve the right to vote?
You're exactly right that this story of American democracy is not something that really has been written by the courts or even by political leaders behind closed doors. It's ultimately come from the energy of ordinary citizens, both demanding their own rights and believing in the promise of democracy. Katie Fahey was dejected reading her Facebook feed after the 2016 election and posted, "Hey, let's do something about, I want to do something about gerrymandering in Michigan. Who's with me?" And then had a smiley face emoji. And from that organized a movement of volunteers that passed the redistricting reform over the objections of so many in the political system that we now see today. Desmond Meade, as you described, is a formerly incarcerated man who could not vote. He's a lawyer, but he could not vote. And he organized an extraordinary movement to pass a ballot measure to end the notorious felony disenfranchisement system in Florida, where 1.4 million people, disproportionately Black Americans, could not vote. And they needed, the Brennan Center worked on it. We actually drafted the language with them of Amendment 4. Honestly, I was skeptical because you need 60% of the vote to pass one of these in Florida. They got 64% of the vote. And the formerly incarcerated people, they didn't hide them. They went door to door and said, "Neighbor, help me get my right to vote back. Help me become a full citizen again." The real story is that regular people are the heroes of the story of American democracy. So what can we all do? We can vote about democracy. We can organize about democracy. We can agitate about democracy. We can speak out and hold our leaders accountable. If we do all of that, even these scary and dystopian things that we are all seeing and focused on will not happen. It will be a moment for progress and not a turn backwards.
Okay, you've absolutely inspired me. I want to be one of these people. What's the one thing that we should all walk away from this with? We were going to be these individual agents of change. We know that this process is long. What's the one thing you want us to walk away with from this talk tonight?
Right now, and as this election year unfolds, demand that everybody running for office tell you exactly what they will do to protect the right to vote, exactly what they will do to make sure our elections are fair and defend our democracy. All of us together can make sure that this fight to vote is at the center of American politics, which I would say is where it ought to be.
Right on, Michael. Fight on. Thank you so much to our terrific audience. Thank you for your questions. They were fantastic. I wish we had time to answer all of them. And we are, of course, incredibly grateful for the sponsorship and partnership of NYU's John Bradamus Center. I'm Melissa Murray with a final quick note from the Brennan Center before we leave you. If you'd like to stay up to date on the key issues that impact our democracy with weekly analysis and insight from Brennan Center experts, please sign up for the Brennan Center newsletter at brennancenter.org/briefing. And be sure to register for great events like this at brennancenter.org/events. Thank you all for coming tonight and for supporting the fantastic work of the Brennan Center.